First off, it's the 50-year anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, there's no point in simply celebrating things because there happens to be an anniversary year. That there needs to be some good reason to look at historical events and commemorate them. I think there's lots of good reasons in this case. There's a wealth of lessons to be learnt from that crisis. Just to turn our mind to contemporary events, like last week, anybody that was tuning in to the BBC coverage of the genocidal assault upon Gaza will have been hearing as a constant drumbeat pounding through one very persistent subtext in all the reports, and that basic subtext is this: if only the resistance would stop firing missiles at Israel, then peace would at once descend on the region. And that is the one thing which comes in every single report. Sometimes it's stated in so many terms, sometimes it's assumed, but that's the one guiding principle of all the imperialist media. Blame the victim, blame the resistance, no support for the resistance. Forget about the fact that Palestine is fighting for her life. Forget about the fact that Gazans are starved and incarcerated in one effectively giant concentration camp in Gaza. If only the victims would have the good sense to stop resisting, the siren voices tell us, then the lion would lie down with the lamb and we could all go home. Now, what's that got to do with Cuba in 1962? Well, this. Back in 1962, the same seductive message could be heard. How arrogant and provocative of the Soviet Union and Cuba to dare to put nuclear weapons on Cuban soil, barely 99 miles from Miami. And what a thing to do. Could they not see that by defending the socialist camp in such an aggressive way, they risked plunging us all into nuclear Armageddon? That was the story then, it's the same story now. And when the missiles were crated up and shipped back to Russia, we were all told then that we can breathe a sigh of relief. Sanity had prevailed, the world was a safer place. Khrushchev's U-turn and Kennedy's iron nerve had somehow saved the day. And that was the wisdom of the apologists for imperialism then and now. Is the world a safer place today than it was in 1962? Are we actually further away from total warfare, the destruction of civilizations than we were in 1962? No, we're actually closer to that. The world is a much more dangerous place. 50 years on from the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the October Crisis as they call it in Cuba, the world has become an even more dangerous place than it was then. Imperialism is plunging into the deepest and most pervasive overproduction crisis ever experienced, leading to austerity and political repression at home and criminal oppressive wars abroad. Socialist countries like China, Cuba and the DPRK remain steadfast, serving as a bridgehead to the future for the ever-expanding ranks of those driven to anti-imperialist resistance in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, all around the world. Decisions that are now taken about how best to resist and overcome imperialism are going to have incalculable consequences for mankind in the coming years. Right now, these decisions are being taken, and it's now that we need to get clear what is the ideological context, what is the ideological basis on which correct decisions can be taken, how best can we fight imperialism. Conflicting opinions on, for example, the forthright approach of countries like North Korea, like DPRK, when it comes to struggling against imperialism, carry an echo of those arguments 50 years ago over the best way for the Cuban Revolution to resist subversion and invasion. The idea, for example, that the hasty removal of Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuban soil by a rattled Khrushchev made the world a safer place doesn't bear analysis. Those who suggest otherwise should remember the cynical honesty of Madeleine Albright when she spelled out what she believed to be the reason Iraq was invaded and the DPRK was not. One possessed weapons of mass destruction and the other did not. Today, the readiness of the DPRK leadership to be forthright in defence of their socialist homeland, clearly identifying and countering the imperialist threat, is habitually presented in the West as the source of tension in the peninsula. Again, how dare they resist? How dare they fight back against imperialist encirclement? Koreans no different, however. Recalling the millions of comrades who sacrificed themselves in the victorious Great Fatherland Liberation War, they know very well the real character of imperialism. They understand very well that the surest hope of peace is to be sought in the most resolute struggle against imperialism and not in the dream of permanent peaceful coexistence with the class enemy. But on the British left, this is seldom understood. Needless to say, the anti-communist Trotskyites simply repeat verbatim the venomous lies and ridicule heaped on the DPRK by the imperialist media. That's what you'd expect from that quarter. The revisionists are more slippery, giving lip service to the defence of socialism, but coming out in a rash when the DPRK risks doing anything that might upset the West. For example, a while ago when the DPRK decided to launch a communications satellite, a prominent CPB member and CND chair Kate Hudson denounced this in the columns of the Morning Star as, quote, unnecessary and provocative. They are, because people fight back. You're only going to make the bully harder if you fight back. She added that, quote, regardless of whether its intentions are peaceful, this step risks others seeing the launch as a threat to regional security. This is the way in which social pacifism serves the class enemy. Now, this issue of how best to tackle imperialist aggression was key to the positions taken by the United States, Russia, China and Cuba in 1962, and throws light on no less burning questions facing the masses today. So the reason why I've begun this with this long digression at the beginning is to say this is not something stranded in history back in the 60s to be sort of raking over the coals of. This is something with parallels. It gives us some hopefully some lessons we can learn taking decisions today. So the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, as I say, it's called the October Crisis by the Cubans themselves. It didn't come out of a clear blue sky. Ever since the Red Army had comprehensively beaten the Nazi war machine and led the liberation of Europe from fascist occupation, the West had returned to its primary obsession, rolling back the socialist camp. By the beginning of the 1960s, that camp had come to include, as well as Eastern Europe and China, also socialist Cuba. The Soviet success in ending the brief US monopoly on the atomic bomb meant that earlier Pentagon dreams of overcoming the USSR through outright nuclear aggression had to be shelved for the moment, giving way to a long-term race in nuclear missiles, accompanied by efforts to destabilize Soviet allies and most notably Cuba. The brilliant achievement of the Cuban people at Playa Girón, or the Bay of Pigs as it's known in the West, in repulsing the shambolic US-backed invasion staffed by counter-revolutionary expatriate scum, rocked the United States back on its heels. For a spell, efforts to undermine the revolution were confined to the murder of revolutionaries, wrecking operations, and the bribing of foreign suppliers to send faulty goods. But again, by 1962, the threats were becoming more overt. 40,000 United States soldiers were sent out on a mock invasion of an unnamed Caribbean island with the supposed aim of overthrowing a dictator codenamed Ort Sack, which is to say Castro backwards. A top-secret report in January prepared for Kennedy spelt out plans to infiltrate CIA agents to carry out sabotage and organise hostile radio broadcasts, and in February, a timetable was prepared for regime change, with plans to begin guerrilla operations in August and September, with a cherry on the fantasy cake in the first 2 weeks of October, quote, open revolt and overthrow the communist regime.